Excuse me. I had a little cough this week and my voice isn't real strong, so thank goodness for microphones. I'm glad we've got them. And I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Danny for that wonderful communion meditation, and I say amen to what he said, especially that part about taking 2 steps at a time. That's amazing. I remember the day, but those days are long gone for me. So, in our reading this morning, Mark chapter 11, verses 22 through 26, which Jack read for us. Thank you, Jack. Might have brought back a little bit of a memory for you from previous lessons that we've had, because we were recently in this same context talking about what Jesus had to say. Just before what Jack read is the account of the withering of the fig tree. So just a few weeks ago, we were talking about that. I'm sure you probably might remember that Jesus had said in the withering of the fig tree that no one shall eat fruit from you. And then the next day, Peter was amazed to notice that the tree had withered from its roots. That was a miracle, but one with great significance. It carried a lot of meaning, because for the Jews in that day and time, the fig tree was a symbol of Israel. And Jesus had come for the last time in his earthly life to Jerusalem. He had been there, of course, many times before. There are records of all 3 of his trips to Passover to Jerusalem. And this was the third and the last. And of course, we know what happened to Jesus when he came to Jerusalem during that last week. And I pointed out before, many times, that the 4 Gospels give a great deal of attention to that last week, which makes it emphatic, important. It's a focus of about 1/3 of the material in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Jesus comes with a heavy heart. In fact, Luke records when he came close to the city, he looked at it and wept over Jerusalem, because they did not recognize the time when God came to them. And of course, he was speaking about himself, coming to Jerusalem to seek and save that which was lost, as we heard him say in the story of Zacchaeus last week. But by and large, he was rejected. And so he came, among other things, to bring that message of judgment. And the tree withering, the fig tree, was a miracle that conveyed that message. And at that same time, he gave a demonstration of judgment when he went into the temple and cleansed the temple by turning over tables and chasing out the money changers and saying that you've turned what's supposed to be a house of prayer into a den of thieves. Jesus also told a parable at that time, the parable of the tenants, which we won't go back over in detail, but recall it to mind, because you remember that it too is a parable of judgment. So through a miracle, a demonstration in the temple, and a parable, Jesus conveyed a singular message that judgment was coming on Jerusalem, and indeed it did about a generation later in the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So that is the literary context of what Jack read. But there's another context. Now, back when I preached about the miracle, the parable, and the demonstration of judgment, I didn't really say anything about what Jesus taught right here about faith and prayer. And to be honest, at the time, I thought, well, Jesus kind of changed the subject. Maybe Mark kind of chopped something in there that didn't fit with the context. But the more I thought about it, I thought, no, it does fit. It fits perfectly. Not only with the literary context, but with what we might call the historical context, which is something we should keep in mind when we study the New Testament, especially historical sections like the Gospels. Now, historical context just means we're asking the question about the text. What's going on? What's happening at this time? And as I mentioned, this was the last week of Jesus' life on this earth. He was fully aware of that and tried to make his disciples understand that this was going to happen. He would be arrested, he would be turned over to the Gentiles, he would be killed and placed in a tomb. But then also, he predicted, would rise again on the third day. But his disciples, as Mark and Matthew both note, did not understand. The meaning was hidden from them. Exactly what that means and how it was hidden, I don't know. Was it God's will for it to be hidden? I don't know. I don't tend to take that view. I think just by their own distraction and misconceptions about the nature of God's kingdom, which they expected him to establish when he came to Jerusalem on this final trip. Maybe that's why the real meaning of what Jesus was saying to them was hidden. But Jesus' awareness and his preparation of his disciples, which constantly had to be on his mind, because think about that. He knew they were going to be on their own before long. Okay, not totally on their own for that long, because he would send the Spirit back to encourage and to empower and to guide them. Yes, that's true. But the progress of the gospel, this culmination of God's long worked out plan for salvation, for redemption, for reconciling himself to mankind, it's now coming to fruition. And it depends on these 12 men. Well, Judas fell out, so 11. They picked someone to replace him. And then another was added later. So there are actually 13 of the 12 apostles, just like there's 13 of the 12 tribes of Israel. But these apostles didn't always demonstrate a great deal of responsibility or spiritual maturity. They, shortly before this time, had been arguing about who was the greatest among them. You remember that. Jesus must have had some pretty deep concerns about how they were going to do after his death, burial, and resurrection, after his arrest. And indeed, they did forsake him and flee. So it makes all the sense in the world that Jesus would talk to them about prayer. It makes sense to me that he would talk to them about having faith in God, which is one of the prerequisites of prayer. Have faith in God. Now, of all the things we do, I think you could make a pretty strong argument of all the acts of worship that we do, whether it's the things that we do here, our giving, the communion, our singing, the acts of service that we do to help people in need, those are acts of worship. Present yourself a living sacrifice, Paul wrote in Romans chapter 12, which is your spiritual service of worship. I don't know if you can find worship just to what we do here in the building, but no, it's a much bigger concept than that in the New Testament. It's all the whole of our response to God, whatever we do for him, to him, through helping other people. That's included. So that's all a part of our worship. So these disciples, it's going to depend on them. And of all those acts of worship, I think Jesus might have felt and might have thought that they need to be tapped into the power that God is going to give them. And prayer is possibly the most intimate time that we ever have in our connection, you and I, with God. Now, if you don't agree with that, that's fine. You can make an argument for something else. But I don't think you'd disagree that this is one of the essentials when it comes to us being connected to God. Prayer. We've got to talk to him. So Jesus, what did he say? I'm on the wrong page, so I'll have to turn over there. But he talked about have faith in God. That's the first prerequisite for prayer being what God intends for it to be and what God wanted it to be for his disciples. Jesus said, to go back to the passage that was read, I tell you the truth. Well, Jesus always told the truth, didn't he? No, of course he did. So why would he say that? Well, he often did. To me, it makes it more emphatic. He's emphasizing, pay attention to what I'm about to say to you. Don't miss this. What I'm saying is the truth, and you need it, so listen up. You know, people do that sometimes. Have you ever been talking to somebody and they say, well, to be honest, and so do you think, well, I guess up to this point you haven't been honest, and now you're going to be honest? Oh, you probably don't think that. No, it's just to emphasize, isn't it? You know, and it does. It makes a difference, I think. We say, okay, well, I'm going to listen up and see what this person thinks is their true honesty. Well, Jesus is emphasizing like that. I tell you the truth. And then what he says is pretty bizarre. It's pretty wild. If anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. And then he goes on in verse 24. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And I'll confess to you that I've read that passage sometimes in the past and wondered, could that really be true? I mean, how exactly am I supposed to understand that? Because I've had the experience, and if you have never had this experience, please come. I want to talk to you after church, of having unanswered prayers. Maybe you prayed for somebody that you loved that was sick, and they died anyway. That happens, and it happens to faithful Christians. It happens to spiritual people who pray and pray a lot. So, however we understand this, it needs to take into account that sometimes God's answer to prayer is no, or wait. Maybe that's his answer to prayer sometimes. He certainly said wait till our prayers for rain for quite a while, didn't he? And how many of you, like me, Friday morning and then, a couple days before that, heard the sound of the pitter-patter on the roof, and you were saying, thank you, God, thank you, thank you. We've been waiting for that for a long time. And I don't know if it's really biblical to confess for other people, but I'll tell you, Craig Schumann took total credit for that. Didn't you, Craig? And he said, you better have me leading the prayer there at the end of church again, because he prayed last Sunday, for rain. And sure enough, it happened. So I know he wasn't being totally serious when he told me that when I saw him at the grocery store, but anyway, I do believe our prayers make a difference. And the place to start, the primary, most fundamental focus for prayer to be what it needs to be and should be in your life and in mine is the first prerequisite, have faith in God. Now, if we have a faith in God, that means we're focused on him. We are thinking about him. We are understanding as much as we're able to what his nature is. And the Bible is full of information on that the greatness of God, the transcendence of God. Now, another prerequisite for prayer that he mentions here is forgiving, and he uses the term anyone. So, having that forgiving spirit. I think the order of these is important. It's significant. Have faith in God is the first point in our lesson that I noticed about prayer. That's where it starts. And that influences everything else that comes afterwards. Understanding the greatness of God. Do we really? You know, the most, I guess I should say the first, and I don't know if it's the greatest of the Ten Commandments, but God did put it first. And he said, I, the Lord, I am your God, I am one. You shall have no other gods before me. And then after that, he talks about idolatry, and you shall have no idols, no false gods, no other gods. It's easy for that to happen. Idolatry was just the thorn in the flesh over and over and over again, all through the Old Testament for Israel. It's what they were condemned for. If you read about judgment in the book of Revelation, idolatry is mentioned over and over and over again. And I wonder, as I've read the Old Testament and thought, what's wrong with those crazy people? They just lived in a pre-scientific age. They didn't have any common sense. They thought, they believed in snake oil type medicine. And so they had all these little idols that they prayed to. They go chop down a tree. Jeremiah made fun of them for doing this. Set it up in a corner and bow down and pray to it. And he said, you fools, you're praying to your firewood. The other half of the tree you use to cook your supper. And the part of it, you're praying to it. It can do nothing. How foolish idolatry is. But perhaps our definition has been too limited. It's too easy to turn the things of this life into God's, to allow the worries and concerns of this life and maybe the deception of wealth, for example, to be in the place in my life where God ought to be. That's idolatry. Paul, in his writing, clearly identified greed as idolatry. That does not recognize the greatness and the transcendence of God. There's so much about this. I have a feeling we may have a two-parter here. Yeah, I think we probably will. Because there's a lot I want to say about the greatness of God, because there's a lot I need to know and understand about it. God's transcendence. You can probably remember from 2 Peter, chapter 3, where Peter talks about how the earth will come to an end and with great fire, and the elements themselves will melt with fervent heat. And then he says, there are skeptics, though, who deny that the world will end in this way and say, ever since our fathers, everything has continued the same. But Peter said when they say this, it escapes their notice that with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. Now, some people have turned that into some kind of a formula. Well, God made the world in 7 days. So that means creation is going to last 7,000 years, and we're about to the end of that time period, and they set up a schedule for the end of the world. Well, the very next phrase in 2 Peter 3 says exactly the opposite. 1,000 years is as a day. Peter's not saying that creation is going to last for 7,000 years. He's saying that time is exclusively a part of our creation, and it's our experience and not his. He lives outside the boundaries of time. I can't understand that. I can see where the Bible teaches it, but to try to understand a God without beginning, a God who is our creator, that was referenced in the prayers this morning. Thank you, Mark, for that. But an uncreated God himself without a beginning? What came before God? Is a foolish question. Nothing. He is the Ancient of Days. He lives outside the boundaries of time and space. In Acts 17, Paul speaking to the Greeks, the Greek philosophers who love to sit around and do nothing more than talk about new ideas and try to understand the world and people. At least you can give them credit for that. They were trying to understand the world. So Paul helped them. If they listened to him, he helped them. When he said that we should not think about our Creator as one who lives in houses or as being made of stone or metal, but our God is invisible. He created everything that has been created. And it's within him that we live and move and have our very being. God is transcendent. The size of our universe is something that helps me to conceive a little bit and stretch my brain a little bit about the nature and transcendence of God. I mentioned recently that we as inhabitants of Earth are on we are on the largest planet in the inner group of planets. Earth is unique. It has a finely and exquisitely balanced set of parameters that allow for life to exist. And that life is just amazingly resilient, isn't it? I mean, give us the time of a couple of years or more of severe drought, and you'd think every one of those bugs and insects and, I don't know, we call them miller bugs. Is that what you call them? I wish I knew more about them. I don't know what the larval stage is, but there's got to be a lot of them someplace. Why didn't they all die of thirst? But we still have them flipping and flapping around in our house. We've got a large light fixture hanging up in our kitchen, and the other morning I was waiting to hear the rain, and I went in there and I thought I heard it. No, it was just a bunch of those millers flying around inside the light fixture. So that was a disappointment. Life just, it's enough to almost make you believe in spontaneous generation. And there was a time when people did believe in that. But of course we know that's not true. It's one of the things we learned from science. I may get in trouble for telling you this, but last year we had these little bugs in our bathroom. Now it wasn't because of housekeeping, okay? Or a lack thereof. I mean, when I get up in the middle of the night, go to the bathroom, when I come back, the bed's made. So that's the kind of housekeeper my wife is. I mean, you know. She's the kind that puts newspapers under the cuckoo clock. You know, so there's no problem with that. That's, you know, her standards are way up there, way ahead of mine, I'll guarantee you, but that's not saying much. So we had these little bugs, and I'm talking about, it looked like a tiny speck on the floor in the bathroom. And I would get a piece of paper and reach down and just squish it and throw it in the trash can. I don't like bugs. Even those teeny tiny ones that just look like a speck. I mean, you couldn't make out legs, you couldn't make out a head or a body or anything like that. It's just a speck that's moving around. So one time I missed, and all of a sudden the speck started going a lot faster. And I thought, wow, I guess that thing has a brain. Can't be a very big brain, but it has a desire to survive, and it's trying to avoid danger. Life is just, our planet is filled with it, as Moses wrote and explained and described in the creation. The seas are teeming with life, and it's everywhere we look. I remember a biology class I took in college. I was amazed when one of our textbooks, and then a professor talked about this, and if I remember right, it was the nematodes he was talking about. Now, I think nematodes are technically worms, but we're talking about tiny, tiny creatures that are not visible to the naked eye. And he said if all matter that comprises the earth, whether organic, inorganic, or whatever, except for the nematodes, were suddenly to disappear, you could still make out the outlines of all the objects, all the earth, all the living things, because they're everywhere. Isn't that a comforting thought? Life is everywhere, microscopic, all the way up to the largest forms that we know of. It's a part of the transcendence of God. How can that even exist? And how can it be so resilient? And we've got all the experts around, and as far as I'm concerned, every one of them could be named Dr. Chicken Little, because all they're trying to do is scare people and control people. And giving control to the experts has made bad problems worse for us, and I hope we've learned something from that. But the world is full of life. It's a part of the transcendence of God. It's part of His greatness, the size of the universe. We talked about if the entire North American continent, think about what that is. I mean, I think Hansford County is big, but it's just a tiny speck when you consider the entire continent it's a part of. So that includes Canada, Alaska, Mexico. I think I'm pointing in the right direction. It's a huge mass of land on the earth. It's not the largest, but it's huge. So if the entire North American continent were considered the Milky Way galaxy, okay? So I hope you're with me. Our solar system is one tiny part of the Milky Way galaxy. How big would our solar system be? And the answer was, as I shared in recent weeks, a coffee cup. The size of a coffee cup in North America, that's as much space as our whole solar system takes up in the Milky Way galaxy, these galaxies are way bigger than anything you've ever imagined before. Even if you tried to imagine a galaxy. 45 years ago, there was a unique occurrence of alignment of the larger planets in our solar system. And because of that, and it was anticipated, you know, our world is made with design, so we can make predictions like that and be pretty accurate. But Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, they were all lined up in a way that only happens once every 175 years. So that's what initiated the Voyager spacecraft, which you may know about. They were launched before some of you were born. In 1977, within a couple weeks of each other, one in late August, one in September, Voyager 2, then Voyager 1, were both launched into orbit on a rocket and began their amazing journeys. By the way, they're still on those journeys, and they're still sending information back to the United States, NASA, to be specific. So, just 5 years ago, after traveling at some 35 to 40,000 miles an hour, their speed varied because as they went by the giants, planets, they figured out a way to slingshot past those and increase their velocity. But they were going at an amazing rate of speed, 35,000 miles per hour, more or less as an average. Just 5 years ago, Voyager 2 left the solar system and is now in interstellar space. And a few years before that, Voyager 1 left. It was launched on a more rapid trajectory. So all those years, all those miles, we're talking about billions of miles now. 18 billion miles. The messages that are sent from that satellite back to Earth, okay, I'm going to wrap this all up. I know, I'm taking too much time. It's just so amazing to think about. And we need to be amazed. If you're not amazed, then you're not getting the picture. God is transcendent. He is so big. He is so amazing. And the number one thing we need to remember that will revolutionize our prayer life and make it what it should be is that God is transcendent. But it takes some 20 hours for those signals to get back to Earth that are traveling at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. Space is so large. How could God create that? How could God speak and create the universe? That's what the Bible says happened. And no other plausible explanation has yet been suggested. Some have been suggested, but as I said, no plausible, credible, believable, unabsurd, which isn't even a word, but you know what I mean by that, theory has been suggested to explain why the universe exists. God is transcendent. Have faith in God. We've got more points about prayer to learn from this text, but I know I'm over time. I've extended into your good graces, so I'll make a deal with you. If you'll come back next week, I'll give that time back. You won't know if I did or not unless you come. So, to think that God is that great, that powerful, that big, that transcendent, and yet He is mindful of us, makes us understand why the psalmist would say, when I consider the heavens, the work of thy hands, what is man that thou art mindful of him? But he certainly is. He created you and me uniquely in his image and wants to have a relationship with you. Do you have it? Let's stand and sing.